Join On the Other Hand today for this.
Focus on relationship building rather than arguing with facts.
This is On the Other Hand, a podcast sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. In this podcast, we explore politics and other issues of importance to Arkansans. We do this through having conversations with community leaders. So stay with us as we talk to another leader in Arkansas who works across differences to get things done and to bring us closer together.
Okay, we're going to start now with round 3, and this is where we talk about what are the potential solutions to polarization and the problems that relate to our excessive polarization in our country. So I'll start with this interesting article I read from 2021, How to Live in Peace. This research, what they did is they did a lot of looking into several countries around the world. They found those countries that seem to have the most consistent historical peaceful society, both within the society and with other countries. And they did a deep dive into figuring out what are the things that seem to have in common with all those most peaceful countries. And it boiled down to one thing, what they call positive intergroup reciprocity. What that means is when societies are more peaceful in a sustainable fashion over time, not just real brief moments, there tends to be a much higher ratio of positive reciprocity behaviors in the country at the citizen level, but overall. So what that means is, think of the golden rule. The golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So it's kind of like that. If you do something nice or positive with another person, and that other person responds not negatively and making it a one-sided thing, but also responds positively with you, that is a positive reciprocity. So when you have that positive reciprocity happening at the individual and the group level in a society, that society tends to be very peaceful. And so they talk about that this overall is determined by these thousands and millions of interactions that happen in the society or community on a day-to-day basis. So it's up to each individual and each group to aspire to that standard of being positive with other groups and individuals, and then the other groups and individuals then have this reciprocal need or obligation to be positive with them. So I thought that was kind of cool.
I love that. There is actually in the communication literature also a norm of reciprocity. So it sounds pretty similar, that if I self-disclose something, that tends to lead to the self-disclosure of another. And I think about that as being good. As you were talking, I was reminded of a model that we use in my department that's actually called positive communication. And this model was actually developed by one of the faculty members in our department, Julian Miraval, who actually, Glen, we should have on our podcast sometime just to talk about the model. I think it would be good. But he talks about 6 different behaviors that I guess I probably, until you said that, I hadn't really thought about using these in the political realm, but I'm going to mention the 6 different behaviors because I think that they are really key things. And then maybe if we could have Dr. Mirval on for a future episode, we can go into more detail. But one of them is just simple greeting, saying hello, good morning. I mean, that seems something simple, but it's just recognizing them in front of my face. Second one is asking. So asking questions to discover the unknown about them. And we've kind of talked about that in terms of getting them to tell their stories. Third thing is complimenting. Is there something I can say that would compliment who they are as a person? Fourth one is disclosing. So disclosing about my own experiences along with asking them about theirs. So that's that norm of reciprocity. Fifth one is encouraging. So I'm actually providing support when they're in need. Okay. And then the last one, and these aren't in any order necessarily, is listening to transcend the difference. And really all of these involve listening. But if we have him on, we'll get more in terms of that. But it reminds me of that positive intergroup reciprocity that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that comes up a lot. It's just that we've got at this. I won't spend much time on it. The focus on relationship building rather than arguing with facts. If we're going to overcome polarization, we have to give up the idea that we're going to convince people that our way is right and their way is wrong. We just need to focus on interacting in a positive way with them and building a relationship so that we dispel some of the stereotypes and we reduce the dehumanizing tendencies. And I think that's really important.
That reminds me, Glenn, of a concept that I teach in my classes called conflict resilience. And this was actually in a 2018 article by a person by the last name of Bourdon. But conflict resilience is the ability to sit with and be fully present around those with whom we have fundamentally different views on critical issues. And so there's a really good quote that I use in my classes, and it's so good that explains this in this relationship that I'm going to read it here. It says, when we sit in the presence of others with whom we may disagree strongly, but with whom we can maintain civility and curiosity, we inevitably discover domains of shared interest and connection. And even when we don't find these, we can often develop an appreciation for why our fellow citizens may hold the views they do. This sitting with does not solve an immediate problem. It prevents the kind of demonization and othering that can escalate and cause new problems down the road, while it promotes humanization and connection. Sitting with conflict is not taming conflict or pretending it's not there. It is discussing it openly, acknowledging the tension and challenge that it can create, but then refusing to let the different views become a corrosive force that blinds us to the reality of common humanity.
Okay.
And that's a beautiful picture of,
Yeah.
we build the resilience over time to get comfortable in the fact that I can sit with another who has different views than me and breathe and be okay.
Yeah.
And focus on the relationship.
I can tell you too that I've had the experience since I got involved with Braver Angels that there's this kind of the before after kind of comparison. That before, I remember times having difficult conversations with people, sometimes with friends, uh, where it got kind of unpleasant and it seemed to be working against the relationship. Once I got into Braver Angels and started learning some of the communication skills that we teach and started applying those in those conversations, I found it very helpful because I noticed I was able then to keep the emotional temperature down a bit by using those skills and prevent the discussion from going too far in a highly emotional and negative direction. So it really makes a difference.
There's a you, Glenn, I'm sure you're aware of this. There's a concept in psychology about holding, and it basically refers to a way of being with another human being in which your empathy reaches out and you let yourself be vulnerable, not in a negative way, but that there is a kind of, I'm holding you in this sort of space that maybe you could call something sacred, that I'll volunteer to give you this place because you're worthy of it. And so that's a stretch sometimes, particularly when there's tension in the air, but it kind of implies some kind of energy goes on, mystical or whatever, between two people that are in deep empathic contact with one another.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that could be a whole different direction of a conversation.
I had a student share a story that I'll share that I think is this helpful here. This was right after, well, during COVID and after the vaccinations had come out, and I've got the story because he gave me permission to share it. And so this person said he was where he was working. I'm not going to say where that is, but he said, I met a man that I was delivering a vehicle for after the pandemic who had very different beliefs than I did about the virus. We did the awkward figuring out what sort of handshake we're doing dance, where one person extends a hand and the other extends an elbow and switches to a fist bump, but the other person has switched to a handshake, and then you both chuckle and embrace that weirdness. We may not remember that. It's been a while since since maybe we were doing that. But I told him I'd had both my shots. This is what this guy says. I told him I'd had both my shots and that I was fine shaking hands. He immediately said, I won't take that vaccine. And with surprising quickness, I just asked warmly why that was. He told me he thought it had all happened way too fast and we don't know what's in them. And his daughter is a doctor and he still wasn't sure about it. I told him that I was glad we could choose what we wanted in this country, but if the authorities telling me that the vaccine is safe and that we should do it for the good of our fellow men, if not for ourselves, we're American scientists, then I'd choose to respect them as the experts. And so anyway, he says, it felt to me that we both walked away from that potentially incendiary topic with a better representation of what the other side looks like because we took the time to actually ask each other. And we both regarded each other with respect. And he says, I still think about this interaction quite a lot. It's very much a solid example of if the person's underrepresented in my life, they're overrepresented in my imagination, because I was able to meet someone that thought that. And I realized they were a human being just like I was.
Very cool.
Nice.
Let me mention something else that I was going to talk about as a potential solution, and it's contact theory. Are y'all familiar with that? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I don't know about y'all. I don't know enough about it to know when it started. My first exposure to contact theory was related to the research on how to deal with the stigma of mental illness. And the basic idea with contact theory is that the more you have personal contact with people who are different or unknown, or you have doubts or fears or anger toward, the more you reduce the negative connotations in that relationship. So, for instance, with people who have a stigma of mental illness, think that most people with mental illness are dangerous or this, that, or the other. And then when they actually have a chance to meet and talk to other people with a history of mental illness, they find out these are real people with real personalities who play roles like I play in life. And they have this one issue, but it doesn't define their entire being as a person. That has been applied to political polarization. And it has been shown that when you have positive intergroup interactions and exposure to opposing viewpoints in that kind of atmosphere, it can foster empathy and understanding. It can reduce prejudice, and it can reduce negative stereotypes. Now, the problem is a lot of people avoid intergroup contact. That's part of the problem, but that's also why Braver Angels advocates reaching out and engaging. And so what they do is we have actually said, and you would know this more, you were involved in this research with Braver Angels outcomes from the workshop surveys, April. But what I show is that after workshops in Braver Angels, the survey showed that 79% felt that they better understood the experiences, feelings, and beliefs of those on the other side, and that they also felt better understood. 75% felt less angry and less estranged toward those on the other side, and 80% felt they were more able to start constructive conversations. So that was an example of where this contact theory, I think, is showing up in what work we're doing with Braver Angels, is to do things that bring people together. And when we do, generally good things happen.
Mm-hmm. And so the question that people have it whenever I talk about this, and I do talk about this in my classes as well, the contact theory is, all right, but I have siloed myself so much that I don't know where to find the people who have different views than me. And so that's the question that we get asked a lot in Braver Angels as well, is that, oh, it looks like everybody sitting around this table is from one persuasion. It's probably, though, not exactly true, because we aren't all, even if we were all representing a Republican group or a Democratic group, we're probably not all the same on all opinions that Democratic and Republican group are. And I just want to say that before Braver Angels, I probably never had political conversations because I was told not to. The niceness, very rarely, except for people really close with me, and then I would avoid it if it would potentially lead into any kind of conflict. But since then, some of my best friends are in Braver Angels, and they're on the opposite side of the political aisle. And I have come to know that they are so much more beautiful as human beings than just their political views. So contact theory has done that for me. I also have been able to see the people that are more extreme than me on my own side differently. And I think that that is also a place that sometimes we forget in contact theory to think about. Is we think about it, well, who is in my out group, right? Well, sometimes my out group actually are the people that are more extreme than me, or who might hold their views, same view that I have, but for different reasons. And I sometimes forget to also reach out to those folks. I still remember the conversation that I had with my sister, in which I really almost didn't have the conversation because she's my sister and I don't want anything to come, didn't want anything to come between us. And this was several years ago. She and I had very different views on COVID and vaccines and lots of other things. But I finally sat down and I just said, so tell me more about these views. And I finally understood. We were on the same side of the political aisle, but she was more extreme than I was. And so it's also important to remember that with contact theory as well. It's not just about the out group, the obvious folk who are very different. It's also sometimes about within our own tribe.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's so many different, we're unique individuals, Yeah. In terms of contact group, the final things I'd say is that, we need this because the truth is we cannot progress as a country. We can't even keep the democracy we've got if we don't get both sides to somehow work together and find common areas of concern where we can compromise, because that's the way our system is built, on compromise. And without coming together, things go in a bad direction, I'm afraid. The other thing is that if you're wanting to ensure that your contact with the other side is as good as possible, you're better off having it face to face rather than Facebook to Facebook. So in person as opposed to social media is another consideration. And then there's even a study from just late 2023 I looked at about quality contact curbing conspiracy beliefs. And it's basically the notion that this contact needs to be more quality than quantity. It's not how often you're around somebody with a different viewpoint, but can you be around them and have a quality, high quality, deep, natural, pleasant, positive experience in that contact? That tends to help reduce the belief in conspiracy theories. It helps bring people together. If you have a lot of intergroup contact, though, and it's negative, as in, confrontational, conflictual, that actually will result in increased conspiratorial thinking on the other side. So when you have those contacts, it also is just really important to be civil. There's that word, civil.
Yeah. I want to say one thing about also, how do you find people on the other side to talk to if you feel like that you're siloed? And one of the things I would really encourage people to do is to take a look at the braverangels.org website, the national website. They have something called one-to-one conversations that are typically broken up into two parts, although there's a couple of them that are just a 1 hour conversation. And they actually match people for the red blue one to try to find people. You can sign up online and they try to find somebody across the US that might be on the opposite political persuasion. But there's other one-to-one conversations also. There's generational one, there's a rural urban one, there's one on race. And so I have my students do this to find somebody in their own life, and they typically, it's easy enough for them to know who it is that disagrees with them. They just don't talk to them normally, but they use that guide to help them have a conversation. The other thing I would say is that I heard a story. This was actually relayed to me by a person in Texas. It's a good friend of mine in Braver Angels, and that person had voted for Trump and was talking to somebody else in their small group, their alliance, that had not voted for Trump. And the person just said to them, I can't work with anybody. I can't work with anybody that voted for Trump, is what the person said to this person who he knew he had voted for Trump. And in relaying the story, he told me, he says, so if you had an issue in your community let's say that there was, a lack of water, or there was a stop sign problem, or traffic issue, or crime, or homelessness, and you really felt strongly about that issue in your community, would you be willing to work with that person if you knew that they had voted for Trump? And that person said, well, absolutely, because we would be working on this issue together. And that is key to actually doing intergroup dialogue and contact theory, is to find a community problem that might be going on in your community that you care about. And you're going to find that there are people also who have different political views than you, who also care about that problem. And you can join hands with them and see them as human beings. So it's just another way of getting to know people across political divides.
Also has no vehicle for triggering our outgroup tribalism. So if we're on a unified, let's build this barn, or let's help this, or it's a beautiful way to work with the other side, and it doesn't trigger any of those things that would have to run it off the track.
That kind of comes back to something I'd mentioned earlier about the importance of building community and community participation. So, for instance, one thing I think that we did in 2024 with Braver Angels here in Central Arkansas was we did a civil conversation series, and that seemed to go well. And there's some talk now about possibly continuing it. We'll see what happens with that. But that would be one example of a place where you could go that was safe to find people with different viewpoints and have those respectful conversations. But another thing that strikes me that kind of also relates to the idea of building community is an initiative right now that's going on with the Rockefeller Institute called the Civic Arkansas Initiative. And what they're trying to do is, because they found that there's so little civic involvement in so many ways in Arkansas compared to the rest of the country, that they're wanting to basically go around the state and find out what we can do to build a community and improve our civic engagement as citizens. And we're involved in that. And so they're having some meetings from time to time in different communities to learn from the members of the community what they think are needed. And then eventually they're going to get people to try to work together on that. So if anyone's interested, contact the Rockefeller Institute and learn about the Civic Arkansas Initiative, because I think that one's going to be ongoing for quite some time.
Both of you make so many beautiful points about how we can relate to one another in a honorable kind of fashion that deepens the roots of our humanity with one another. But let me just throw something out that concerns me. As beautiful as that is, does it feel like that there has to be some structural changes in our political system? Because we talk about political polarization. And I have my own fear that so much negative energy is coming down from both parties in the language they use and the policies they can't agree upon, that does Braver Angels reach out and try to get buy-in from politicians to spread the message?
Yeah, Jerry, that's a great question. There is an arm of Braver Angels that's called Braver Politics, and they have been developing workshops for legislators in particular. Most of it's been happening at the state level, not at the national level, in which how to talk across the divide, how to have difficult conversations with constituents. And in some states, there actually has been some grant work. Utah and Washington State, both of those, I know that there's some grants right now that they are using to try to work in their legislative system to try to increase depolarization and ability to work together. There has been some support and coverage also of some common ground initiatives at the national level in terms of legislators. I haven't seen the work done at the presidential, that level of our three branches of government or the Supreme Court. It's about the work that I've seen in Braver Angels has been at the legislative level primarily, and it's in, again, if people want to look it up, they can look up Braver Politics. So there are people that are being trained to do that kind of work, and people that are doing that kind of work. New Hampshire is an example of this. A lot of work's been done with their state legislature there. And so the work that's been done there, they're trying to bring into the state of Utah and the state of Washington State, just to try out, pilot it, and see if it will work in other states, and have some grant funding to do that. I'm not as, it's just really kind of in the nascent or new stages in terms of testing it. But if it works there, we may go to other places as well. I've not been personally involved in it, but it is something that's a great question. And I do think people say, well, why does it make a difference if we're just building these relationships one at a time? We're still not making a dent in politics. Well, they have been reaching out to some politicians that are actually connecting together, and sometimes we'll interview people across political divides. So an example of this is Spencer Cox in Utah. I know the Governors Association, he's the governor there. He and another governor who was on the other side of the political aisle, they actually put together a Talking Better kind of campaign. That's not the name of it. It was better worded than that, but basically a Conversing Better campaign that governors could also be working on. But that was not a Braver Angels initiative, but he is a Braver Angels friend. And when I say friend, like would speak at our annual conferences and things.
I guess what concerns me is the power of the work y'all are doing is so wonderful. And there's so much opposing negative energy coming down from the top. It's like a tsunami at times. And I just wonder, and it's wonderful to hear that there's getting buy-ins from state legislatures, which a lot of those people will eventually move up to higher office. So that's good to hear.
And I would address not just with Braver Angels, but my thoughts on your question about, I have appreciation for your pessimism or your doubts about the way things are going, because it's such a bad time, it seems, in our country with so many negative forces against resolving the political polarization issue. But one is, I think, what we do in Braver Angels and other organizations like this helps resolve basically one relationship at a time. So if you do this on a broad scale and keep going, getting more people to reach across the aisle to learn more respectful ways of being with the other, then I think you will eventually start to see a shift in voting patterns, and maybe the moderates will start punching their weight, right?
Yeah.
So that would be one hope. Another thing that's kind of been implied, and I'm not necessarily endorsing it, because the two parties have kind of taken their views and kind of split into two opposite directions. A third viable party of people who are pro Democratic Republic and pro respectful, that kind of thing, may be the kind of thing that starts to break up that polarization. That might be another possibility. Another thing that I know you both know about, that has given every indication it can make a big difference in terms of being a more pro-moderation outcome in elections, is ranked choice voting or something like that. So that, that tends to reward people who have more mainstream or moderate stances as opposed to extremists. And then you kind of talked about this, Jerry, and I failed to mention, but I really totally agree with you. We're all looking for someone to come rescue us, that imposing, highly moral, engaging, positive figure. They have come around at times in our country and in other countries throughout history, and so it could still happen here And that to me is the hope that I have when I see all the dark forces that seem to be going on and working against us, is that, you know, as much as fear and anger rules the day, it seems like there seems to be room for and a yearning for some positive approach, for some leader who is positive and engaging and at least to somewhat optimistic. And I think that's still possible to happen. And I'm hopeful, whether
And
it's some or a combination of that.
I fully appreciate that Braver Angels has to overall keep a very neutral stance.
Right.
But this is a little humorous, but it did occur to me. I would certainly vote for Braver Angels ballot.
Thank you.
That's all. That's all I would need to know.
yeah, and I certainly I agree with that. Our political system, in terms of the two-party system and the way it currently is operating, is not leading towards that kind of hope. But I do think that there's so many people that are wanting to change it, that if we don't get too exhausted in the middle, that we can be making a difference in our own worlds at least. And then we have a pretty good media presence too, Jerry, at the national level, in terms of people who are getting some good input. Monica Guzman is an example of that, where she is really being heard and interviewed, and just going in different places and talking about that. She's more on the liberal side of the fence. And then we have John Wood Jr., who is also an ambassador, who is on the conservative side of the fence. Monica, I know, has a podcast that's called The Braver Way, that she's been doing for a while, where she'll bring in people that are thought leaders across different political divides, and actually has a person by the name of April Lawson that sometimes comes in and bounces things off, because April's on the other side of the political aisle on most things. And so we do have some models, and the bridge building organizations that have proliferated over the last few years are an example of this also. Living room conversations is one that I highly recommend if persons want to start having these kinds of conversations in their living room and go towards more of a dialogue. But there are many organizations across the U.S. and globally that are trying to do this work. So the goal that our founder, one of our founders and president, David Blankenhorn, says, is that he wants us to have a social movement, something that takes over the equivalent of the airwaves, right? That starts just running through our belief systems, and we don't even know necessarily where it came from, because it just becomes so ingrained in us. I think about, just generationally, some of the things that my daughters believe in that I didn't grow up in, and what happened in a generation, that actually the social movements that led to the belief systems, and don't have to go into the details of what those are, but that's having this as a social movement kind of mentality has been the goal of our president for a while.
Yeah, and I think you guys are planting a lot of seeds that I can conceive of as growing and moving up the chain and finally neutralizing what's coming down from on highs.
Well, that's perhaps a good time to wrap things up. Do we have any final comments before we finish up?
I think this has been fun. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
I didn't know for sure what it was going to be like, but Glen, I always like working with you, and Jerry, you're a wealth of information too to learn from. I've written down several couple of pages of notes, just things that I want to be thinking about, and that's what I hope that people will find as they listen to our podcast. But these particular episodes in particular, is that maybe there'll be one or two nuggets that they take from the episode, and this will be multiple episodes, that they take and they say, okay, let me kind of think about that. Let me try this out. Let me look into this. And that's my hope from our time together.
Yes, that's great.
And I just say, everybody get involved at whatever level you can, even if it's just changing the way you interact with your neighbor or your family member or something. And look up braverangels.org or arkansas.braverangels.org for more information. And we thank you so much. And Jerry, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, it was a wonderful experience. I always learn when I'm around you guys. So thanks.
And we learned from you in April. Yeah, you're just so delightful to work with and just full of good information. So I really appreciate doing this. Okay, that's all we've got for this series of conversations about political polarization, which I'm referring to as an update on political polarization research and thoughts. So thank you, all our listeners, for listening in. Thanks, and have a good evening.
Listeners with questions or suggestions for On the Other Hand can contact us via the podcast page of the Braver Angels Arkansas website. You can find that at arkansas.braverangels.org. And there you can also find links to all our conversations with other guests. Thanks for joining us on today's edition of On the Other Hand, where Glenn and I had a conversation with Jerry Henderson about recent research and thinking about polarization and related topics. This is a multiple episode conversation that we had, so we hope that you will listen to all of the episodes on this, as well as our other conversations on the Other Hand with other guests. Find us at arkansas.braverangels.org. You can find us on the podcast page of that website or on many popular podcast sites. On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band, Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
From your host, Glen White
and April Chatham Carpenter.
Let's each do our part to bring our community closer together.